Hi friends, I'm Steve Rode, and boy, I'm really glad you're here with me today. The story we're about to step into is not an easy one. In fact, researching it was very disturbing. I went through nearly 1,500 pages of court filings, public records, and media reports to prepare this episode. And some of what I read was heartbreaking. It was terrible. That was my weight to carry, and I'm not going to put that full burden on you. My promise is to tell the truth, but to shield you from the worst of it. What latched on to me in this case wasn't just the crimes. It was the destroyed childhoods, the survivors who were ignored for decades, and the sheer number of chances to stop him that were missed. That's why I knew I had to go deep and tell this story. But here's the thing. Telling stories like this isn't just about exposing darkness. It's about accountability. It's about hope that by listening and by learning, we can make sure vulnerable people are protected better in the future. Thank you for trusting me with your time. Let's take this journey together. Before we begin, a note to listeners. This episode contains discussion of child exploitation. You will not hear graphic detail here, because the real story is not in the acts themselves, but in the power, the betrayal, and the systems that failed to protect children. And every fact in this episode is carefully supported by court records, public documents, and contemporary reporting. At the end, stick around and I'll tell you how you can access all of the source material yourself. A Miami courtroom, February 2025. The judge leans forward. His voice cuts across the silence.
210 years in prison.
With that sentence, the story of 72-year-old Michael Geilenfeld finally reached its conclusion. Now convicted of federal child exploitation crimes as horrific and evil as you can imagine. The man once celebrated as a savior would never walk free again. And it wasn't for a single crime. Prosecutors told the court his abuse stretched across 3 decades, and at least 20 boys coming forward over the years. But here's the harder question. How did he get away with it for so long? To understand how Michael Geilenfeld hid in plain sight, we need to go back. Back to Iowa, where he was born. Back to the story he began telling about himself. In the 1980s, Iowa newspapers described him as a guardian angel for street kids, a white American man who had moved to Haiti to start an orphanage for boys, a missionary who gave up comfort at home to live among the poor. He was written about as though he was a saint, selfless, godly, devoted. For donors and church groups, it was irresistible. Here was a man who seemed to embody sacrifice, a man who put faith into action, a man who looked like the very image of good. But appearances are powerful, and sometimes appearances can be a shield. By the early 1990s, his orphanage was receiving glowing coverage in U.S. newspapers. He was celebrated on church bulletin boards, held up as an example of what faith could do in action. But the story people believed was not the story unfolding inside those walls. Michael Geilenfeld built his image not only through press clippings, but through gratitude. Gratitude carefully staged and carefully performed. Visitors from the U.S. would come to Haiti eager to see the orphanage their dollars supported. And they would see boys lined up in clean shirts, boys bowing their heads in prayer, and boys singing hymns and performing dances that told a story of redemption. Every hand clap, every smile, every bow of thanks, all of it reassured donors that their money was saving lives. But gratitude can be weaponized. Every performance became another piece of evidence that Michael was exactly who he said he was. Every donor letter reinforced the myth that he was selfless, that he was holy, that he was good. In reality, that gratitude served another purpose. It was a cloak, a way to silence questions and a way to keep people from looking closer. And it worked, because in the minds of donors, only someone virtuous enough could inspire such loyalty. But the gratitude wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. It was curated, and it was weaponized. Boys were taught how to tell their stories to visitors, how to talk about life on the streets, and how to credit Michael Geilenfeld with their salvation. Every testimony of rescue reinforced his image. Every smile, every prayer became another free pass. And when questions arose, and they did, when whispers of abuse surfaced, and they did, these stories of gratitude drowned them out. How could a man celebrated by so many be guilty of what a few were alleging? This is how institutions miss warnings, not always by conspiracy, but by believing in the story they most want to be true. And each time that happened, it was another missed opportunity. The boys of St. Joseph's were not only told to show gratitude, they were turned into performers. Trips were organized, performances staged in churches and community centers across the United States. American audiences applauded, and boys sang and danced in traditional Haitian style. Every performance ended with smiles and prayers of thanks for Michael Geilenfeld. It was theater, and that theater raised millions of dollars. That theater convinced donors they were funding miracles.
400 years will not be enough for what this monster did.
On the stage, they were stars. Behind the stage, they were children without a voice. And once again, gratitude became a shield, a way to keep people from seeing the truth. For years, the truth about Michael Geilenfeld traveled only in whispers. Rumors on the streets of Port-au-Prince, warnings from boys who had slipped away. But whispers rarely become headlines. And that began to change in 2011. Paul Kendrick, a child advocate from Maine, began writing emails, newsletters, blog posts. And over the next several years, he sent thousands of them out. Each one accused Michael Geilenfeld of being a predator. And Kendrick wasn't the only one. In Atlanta, another child advocate, Valerie Dirksen, spoke out after working in Haitian orphanages. She too warned that Michael Geilenfeld was abusing boys. His response was not accountability. It was a lawsuit. He sued Dirksen for damage. They abandoned that lawsuit. The pattern was clear. When survivors or advocates spoke up, Geilenfeld turned to the courts, and those who tried to provide warnings often paid a price. Dirksen fought a lawsuit. Kendrick faced financial ruin. Survivors endured years of disbelief. In 2013, Geilenfeld and his U.S. fundraising arm, Hearts with Haiti, sued Kendrick for defamation. Together, they claimed his warnings were lies. A federal jury agreed, awarding them more than $14 million in damages. It was a crushing blow. Not only were survivors dismissed, but the man amplifying their voices was financially ruined. And a U.S.-based nonprofit that had raised money for Geilenfeld's orphanages had stood beside him in court.
We've been telling our story for years, and nobody believed us. They told us we were ungrateful and Michael was doing good things. Why would you lie on him like that?
On appeal, that federal verdict was overturned on jurisdictional grounds. But a related case in Maine, state court, ended in a settlement. Roughly $3 million was paid to the nonprofit, not to Geilenfeld personally. At the time, the nonprofit had no definitive proof of abuse. But earlier, they had defended him publicly, even in court, insisting the accusations had cost them millions in lost donations. The nonprofit has since emphasized that Geilenfeld was never an employee, he was not a board member, and he was not a volunteer, and that they severed all ties with him in 2014, a decade before his U.S. conviction. But by then, the damage was done. Kendrick had been punished for speaking out too soon, before the system was ready to hear it. And Geilenfeld, once again, walked away with the appearance of vindication. Even before the courtroom battles, there were missed opportunities. One of the clearest happened at Miami International Airport. When Michael Geilenfeld arrived in the U.S., Homeland Security agents searched his belongings. Among them were photographs of Haitian boys. Agents flagged the photos. The images were questionable. But after a closer look, they let him go. In the paperwork, those photos were not classified as child pornography, which meant Michael walked free. Years later, investigators would say those photos were not souvenirs of children he had helped. They were images of victims and witnesses, 11 hard copies, part of a photo array. Evidence prosecutors believed he carried to intimidate, even to bribe, the very people who might testify against him. The same man who had built his life on choreographed gratitude was still working to control the story, still holding on to the faces of those who might testify against him. And it wouldn't be the last time process and the systems meant to protect the vulnerable ended up protecting him instead. Because what happened at the airport in Miami wasn't an isolated failure. It was part of a larger pattern, one that stretched from Haitian courtrooms to U.S. embassies to the very nonprofits that raised money for his work. By 2025, the whispers had become evidence. The case moved into a Miami federal courtroom. 6 men, once boys at St. Joseph's, sat at the witness stand. The air was heavy with the smell of old varnish and paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a reminder of how long justice had taken to arrive. Each man told his story of what happened between 2005 and 2010. Each described how Michael Geilenfeld used power, trust, and God's language to take what was never his. For many, this was the first time their voices were not brushed aside. The words came without rehearsal, a raw truth spoken at last in a room where it had to be recorded and it had to be believed. The defense pushed back. They said these men were motivated by money. They wanted payouts. That it was greed, not truth. But jurors saw it a different way. They saw a pattern. They heard the same story in different voices, and they believed. Inside that Miami courtroom, survivors finally spoke for themselves. No intermediaries, no newsletters or donor reports, just their voices, carrying decades of pain. The words fell heavy across the courtroom, as if decades of silence had been compressed into a single sentence. Another survivor leaned forward, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what had taken place. "Michael, you stole my identity. You stole who I am." He wasn't talking about paperwork. He was speaking of his boyhood, the childhood he could never get back. And then, one of the youngest voices in the courtroom. "This orphanage destroyed my childhood. The only thing that can make me forget is death." One after another, their words cut through the courtroom. Not choreographed dances, not donor letters, but testimony, unrehearsed, undeniable. Some survivors went further, describing him as deliberate, even diabolical. One called him a diabolical psychopath, and another said, "It's not my fault to have no mother, no dad. Somebody takes me to the orphanage. I think they're going to save my life, and what they do is destroyed my life." He knew exactly what he was doing, they said. He wrapped himself in the language of God, using faith as his cloak. To them, he was just the abuser. He was a man who weaponized religion itself. And for the first time, the truth was not dismissed as rumors or bitterness. It was entered into the record and believed. Even as survivors prepared to testify in Miami, letters of support for Michael Geilenfeld poured in. They came from friends, from church members, and from mission trip visitors. Each one insisted he was not a criminal. He was a man of God. And it wasn't only individuals. Even a U.S.-based nonprofit that raised money for his work lent credibility in the U.S. courts, even issuing a 2015 press release celebrating a shared legal win, before later saying they had severed ties. These letters did more than praise his work. They echoed the story he told about himself. A humanitarian persecuted by lies, a man of God unfairly maligned. Even as he would later testify, he felt he was a gay man facing prejudice in a homophobic country. Each of these narratives shifted the focus away from survivors and back onto him. And for decades, whenever survivors spoke up, they were told their stories were about money. They wanted payouts. They were motivated by greed. It was easier to dismiss them as opportunists than to confront the possibility they were telling the truth.
Michael has always been a person of good character. He is a 73-year-old man of God who has devoted his life to serving others.
But for survivors, these glowing defenses cut deep. They were reminded yet again how hard it was to be believed. These weren't just kind words from supporters. They were shields. Virtue used as a cloak, covering what survivors have been saying all along.
None of the boys, including those involved in this lawsuit, ever expressed dissatisfaction with Michael. They only had gratitude.
The courtroom heard a very different story.
For years I carried this pain in silence. I thought nobody would ever believe me. Now the world knows what he did to us.
Without Michael's care, these boys would have died or turned to crime on the streets. He gave them a loving home and a chance at a better life.
The defendant preyed upon some of the most vulnerable children in the world, using charities, even ones connected to Mother Teresa, as a plaything. This is the worst of the worst.
For decades, Michael Geilenfeld's image had been untouchable. The saintly rescuer, the man of God, the guardian angel for street kids. But every facade has cracks. By the mid-2010s, the cracks began to show. Donor trust began to erode. A U.S.-based nonprofit that had defended him in court told the courts that allegations had cost them millions in lost donations. And questions about lawsuits, about whispers of abuse, could no longer be pushed aside. Even one of the US-based nonprofits that had once defended him in court would later distance itself. By the time US prosecutors filed charges, Geilenfeld was no longer the face of miracle-making missions. The myth of sainthood was collapsing, and in its place, the truth was beginning to emerge. By 2014, Haitian authorities had issued a warrant for Michael Geilenfeld's arrest. Survivors had spoken to investigators. Charges were filed, and he was arrested in Port-au-Prince. But the case stalled, and witnesses were intimidated. Procedural breakdowns happened, and corruption. Court documents later revealed that Haitian social services shut down the St. Joseph's Home for Boys because of child welfare concerns. Geilenfeld himself admitted under oath that bribes were discussed, with one associate simply saying, "Money talks." And after months in jail, Geilenfeld was set free. Rather than stay in Haiti, he slipped across the land border into the Dominican Republic. There he began again, creating a new mission, even as Haitian courts issued yet another arrest warrant in 2015. Yet when questions of his safety arose, the U.S. Embassy intervened. Homeland Security escorted him back to the United States, saying it was for his own protection. And prosecutors would later state they had no record that the Haitian warrant had ever been withdrawn. It was yet another missed opportunity to hold him accountable. Another moment where process and protection outweighed accountability. But once back in the U.S., the walls around Michael Geilenfeld began to close in. Federal prosecutors built their case, and this time, there would be no escape. The trial ended, the jury spoke, and now it was time for sentencing. One by one, survivors gave their impact statements. They spoke of years lost, of childhoods stolen, of the pain of being dismissed for decades.
I grew up thinking my suffering didn't matter. Today, at least, I know someone finally listened.
And then it was the judge's turn.
The defendant preyed upon some of the most vulnerable children in the world, using charities, even ones connected to Mother Teresa, as a plaything. This is the worst of the worst.
210 years. The maximum sentence. Michael Geilenfeld would never walk free again. For survivors, it was justice. But it was also decades too late. After Michael Geilenfeld's conviction, U.S. nonprofits connected to him sought to explain their role. They stated they had severed ties years earlier. But the record shows a more complicated history. To understand just how long it took to hold him accountable, we need to follow the timeline. 1990s, survivors in Haiti whispered of abuse. Some boys ran away. Community members raised suspicions. Nothing stuck. 2011, child advocates Paul Kendrick in Maine and Valerie Dirksen in Georgia raised public alarms. For their warnings, they were sued and discredited. In 2012, in Raleigh, North Carolina, a federal grand jury investigation was opened. Court-filing state prosecutors subpoenaed records from Hearts with Haiti. No indictment followed, but questions had clearly reached federal attention. 2014, Haitian social services shut down the St. Joseph's Home for Boys. Geilenfeld was arrested and jailed on abuse charges. He was released in 2015 amid allegations of corruption and bribery. 2015, despite all this, a U.S. fundraising partner issued a joint press release with him, celebrating a legal win against Paul Kendrick. 2017, The Raleigh News and Observer newspaper reported that a nonprofit legal update described Geilenfeld as a good and faithful person. 2024. Federal prosecutors in Miami finally brought the case that ended in his conviction. By then, survivors had been waiting decades to be believed. And woven through that timeline are darker truths. Court records show survivors' alleged abuse not only in Haiti, but also during trips to the United States. And Geilenfeld was not the only threat in that home. Testimony revealed he allowed dangerous men, even a known pedophile, even a man who stabbed a boy in the chest, to stay in the house with children. But here's what makes this case even harder. This conviction doesn't account for every act of harm that happened under his watch. Frankly, we'll never know the full extent of those destroyed lives. And layered over that is the reality of Haiti itself. A country where government systems are fragile, where corruption is real, and where witnesses may have been in hiding, silenced, or simply impossible to locate across borders. What happened in court in Miami was a reckoning, but it was not the whole story. For 30 years, he collected free passes. From donors who chose belief over evidence, from churches that saw his missionary image as proof of virtue, from courts in Haiti that dismissed charges, not because he was innocent, but because the procedure failed and corruption allegedly played a role, from embassies that followed protocol and left survivors abandoned, and from U.S. nonprofits that once raised money for his homes and even defended him in court, before later saying they had severed ties. Court records reveal one of the most chilling examples of how danger was not only ignored, but normalized. In sworn testimony, Michael Geilenfeld admitted that one of his close associates stabbed a boy in the chest. And yet, Geilenfeld allowed that man to remain in the home around those boys. I mean, think about that for a moment. A child was attacked inside a place that donors believed was a sanctuary. And instead of removing the threat, the man in charge defended the attacker and kept him close. If something this stark wasn't enough to sound alarms, what would have been? How could anyone still believe this was a safe place? And that wasn't the only case. Testimony showed he knowingly allowed pedophiles to stay at the orphanage. The very men who should have never been near vulnerable children were welcomed inside, under his protection. In lawsuits and potentially in fundraising appeals, he cast himself as a real victim, a humanitarian persecuted by lies, a man of God maligned by bitter critics, and even in his own testimony, a gay man unfairly targeted in what he described as a homophobic country. Each story shifted the focus away from survivors and back onto him. And the way he cloaked himself in religion, hiding behind God while betraying children, it's not unique. It reminds me of another episode I did, Betrayal of Justice, where a county prosecutor wrapped himself in a religious cloak while allegedly exploiting 50 women. Different case, different victims, but the same pattern, predators borrowing the aura of faith, not to serve God, but to shield themselves from scrutiny. If you haven't heard it yet, you can find Betrayal of Justice in the podcast feed. Just look wherever you're listening now. The cost of warning was high. One survivor testified that after agreeing to tell his story, his wife in Haiti was kidnapped, raped, and burned. There was active intimidation of victims and payments to keep them silent. The message was clear: silence protected you, and truth put you in danger. And even institutions designed to uphold justice became shields. When Haitian courts issued a warrant for his arrest, Michael Geilenfeld jumped on a bus and fled across the border into the Dominican Republic. And when questions of his safety arose, Homeland Security officials helped escort him back to the United States, even as the Haitian warrant remained active. Another missed opportunity, where procedure and protection outweighed accountability. And maybe here lies the final irony. For years, Michael Geilenfeld was described in saintly terms, a guardian angel, a man of God, and even a savior. And after his conviction, the language swung to the opposite extreme, a monster, the worst of the worst. But both extremes hide the truth, because predators don't endure by being seen as evil. They endure by being seen as good. And the real story is not sainthood or monstrosity, but how image itself became the shield that kept children from being believed. If this episode has been difficult to listen to, that's because it should be. But if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe survivors' voices deserve to be heard, I'd like to ask you to do me a favor and leave a 5-star review of this podcast on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It helps others find the series, and it tells the world that these stories, as hard as they may be, deserve to be told. When justice finally came, it came decades too late. The gavel fell, the sentence was read, and Michael Geilenfeld would be led away, never to walk free again. But the cost of silence cannot be measured in years alone. One survivor said,
"The only thing I ever wanted was to be believed."
Childhoods destroyed, trust destroyed, faith destroyed. For decades, survivors were dismissed as ungrateful. Donors clung to the illusion of good. Institutions placed reputation above truth. And in that silence, Michael thrived. Law enforcement and courts will say they followed procedure. And in many ways, they did. But process explains the delays. It does not excuse the failures. Justice demands more than paperwork. It demands urgency. It demands belief. It demands truth. Michael Geilenfeld collected free passes from every side, from donors and churches and courts and even governments. Some gave them through process, others through blind faith. Each one was a missed opportunity, and each one a betrayal. And maybe this is the final irony. In the 1980s, the press called him a guardian angel for street kids. And after his conviction, prosecutors and survivors called him a monster, the worst of the worst. And this case focuses on Geilenfeld's actions, not only what he did, but also what happened under his watch by others to the children in his care, funded by money from donors who thought they were doing good. That distinction matters, because even if he wasn't the only source of harm, it was his shadow that allowed so much to happen. This has been The Savior Who Wasn't, How Michael Geilenfeld Hid in Plain Sight. Another installment of true crime cases you haven't heard. If this story was hard to hear, that's because it should be. But telling these stories with respect and with care and with the truth is how we honor survivors and how we begin to understand the systems that failed them. If you'd like to go deeper, you can find every source document for this episode on the episode page at truecrimeunheard.com. That's where I've posted the court filings, the media reports, and the public records that help build this story. I'm Steve Rode. I'll check in again with you next week with another true crime case you haven't heard. And if you value this work, if you believe survivors deserve to be heard and these stories deserve to be told, please leave me a 5-star review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It makes a real difference.